Gabriel, a Poem, 2014, is a book-length elegy for his son, and Stranger by Night in 2020. He's also published 8 books of prose, among them How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Your Poetry, a national bestseller, 100 Poems to Break Your Heart, and The Heart of American Poetry. Amongst other awards, he's received the National Book Critics Circle Award, a Pablo Neruda Medal of Honor, the famous poet from, was it Peru? That's what I meant, Chile. And the National Jewish Book Award. His new book is a memoir, My Childhood in Pieces, a stand-up comedy, a Skokie elegy published last year. Since 2003, he's served as president of the Guggenheim Foundation. Would you please welcome a wonderful speaker, Edward Hirch.
Unfortunately, things happen to people. I hope we'll be lucky.
Hi everyone, so glad to be with you. This Chabad is so beautiful. Aspen is so beautiful. It just reminds me so much of the stories that my grandfather told me about the shtetl. I'm going to talk to you about my memoir, and I'm going to tell you how I came to write it and recite some things from it, and then read you a little bit, mostly just talk to you. And then I hope you'll have questions and we can have a question and answer period, because I like that best of all. In 2019, my mother died, and I mourned for her. She had a very difficult last few years, and I spent the year mourning as you do, and then the pandemic hit. And during the pandemic, I wrote a book called The Heart of American Poetry. But I had more time than I usually have. I was running a foundation, but was all remote, no events, no traveling. And I had this tremendous urge to start writing down some of the things that my mother had said to me. And so the first thing I wrote was, I said to my mother, she was stirring some soup on the stove, and I said, you know, you really shouldn't make fun of me, you're my mother. And she said, don't be so short, kid. When I was in high school, I was studying the Enlightenment, and I said, hey Mom, I'm reading about the Enlightenment, that's the study of universal truths. She said, you want a universal truth? Women love shoes. So when I wrote this down, my mom started coming back to me. Like I began to feel her. And so I began thinking about my grandmother. And so I remembered my grandmother said, if I had a brain sale, I charge the most for yours. So I said, why? Because I'm the smartest one in the family? No, because yours have never been used. There's my grandmother. So I remember a story about my grandmother. It was a story about my sister Leni and me. There was a girl who was going to hit my sister Leni with a broom handle. And I stepped forward to keep this from happening. I was 8, Leni was 7. And so the girl, Roberta, hit me instead. And so blood was everywhere. I ran home. My parents were divorced. My grandmother was taking care of us. And so I ran home, and I was holding my head together, and I was screaming, my brains are falling out, my brains are falling out, my brains are falling out. So my grandmother was imperturbable, and she got her purse. She took Leni and me by the hand. We're in Chicago. She went outside. She hailed a cab. As I was getting in the cab, she said, you don't have the brains you're born with. I don't see how anything can start falling out now. So these are bringing back the people to me. And so my father, who was a Ruby, I had two fathers. My first father, Ruby, was a kind of wannabe gangster. And I remember one of his favorite sayings, "What's a co-signer? A schmuck with a pen." And he had a lot of sayings about food, and they stayed with me as if they were haiku. Poppy seeds are the only seeds that matter. Never order white bread on a sandwich. If anyone orders white bread, you know their family came over on the Mayflower. Don't get suckered into a thin cut of bologna. The greatest steak in the world cannot compare to a kosher hot dog. Like that. And moon strudel can change your life, but don't call it poppy seed strudel. That means you don't know what you're talking about. And my father came rushing back. So I started to just write these down, and I gave them titles, each one a little thing, and then just the way I told it to you. And I started remembering things my grandfather had said. He wasn't so funny, but he spoke in parables. The very first thing in my book is called All Sales Are Final. God is like my old boss on Maxwell Street, my grandfather said. You may get home and discover that your new shirt doesn't have a back, but you're still not going to get a refund. So I like this so much that I thought, okay, I'll make a prologue. The prologue is, my grandparents taught me to write my sins down on paper and cast them into the water during the first day of the new year. They didn't expect an entire book. So I began channeling this method, which was basically everyone what they said to me. And I started to think, well, maybe I could write a memoir in a way that no one has ever written a memoir before, where you don't sort of reflect back with the wisdom of the ages the way many people do and tell you what they've learned. I wonder what it would be if I just kind of catapulted you back so that you experienced it the way we experienced it. And so you get a kind of kid's point of view and see, and everyone in my family was sort of on the hustle in Chicago, and everyone was really fast and they were really cutting. And so as a kid, you're just trying to keep up. And so I thought, what if I try and do this? So I remember a story my whole life that my mother's younger sister, my Auntie B, had said to me, which is, I started to sob when the nurse pointed you out in the nursery. Auntie B said, you were the strangest looking infant I'd ever seen. You were all eyes and nose, and your face trailed behind. Your hair was spiky. You were emaciated. You looked like you were born in an alley. Yeah. Then I thought of something then. I call it, the next piece is family resemblance. All my life people have said that I look like B. So I began coming back with this way. And I began to understand certain things about my childhood that I didn't know, which is my grandfather moved to Chicago because he got a job. He was living in Rochester, New York, and he went broke because he was in the kosher meat business and he wouldn't pay off a group of crooked rabbis, so therefore they wouldn't certify his meat. So he went out of business and moved to Chicago, and he was a stringer for the Yiddish paper Der Tag, and he sold ads through the Midwest. I asked my grandmother about his job. She said it was Meshuggah. He's selling ads for the Tag in Iowa and Nebraska and Ohio. And my grandmother stayed behind with their two daughters, and then there was my grandfather was in a rooming house, and there was a rumor that he was keeping company with a widow. And 2 days later, my grandmother picked up and moved to Chicago with my mother and my aunt. And she was coming out of the Chicago train station, and she had 2 suitcases, and she fell. And she said, "You see, even the sidewalks in Chicago are crooked." And they moved to Logan Square, and my grandparents told me there were signs that said, on many buildings, no no dogs or Jews allowed. My grandfather said, yeah, but in Latvia they had signs that said, no Jews or devils, welcome. He goes, so apparently in Chicago, devils are okay. Dogs are not. And the reason I started discover that they were following Jewish migration patterns. Like they started in Logan Square and then they moved further north and they moved to Rogers Park. I was born in Irving Park and then they eventually moved to Skokie. And I discovered that the world I was writing about was vanishing, and then I thought it was vanished. Not just the people that I was bringing back, but the world that they represented. And when we moved to Skokie when I was 10, there were, my parents were very assimilated Jews, and it was like 40% Jewish, but there were still 7,500 or 8,000 Holocaust survivors. And you could see European history seemed very far away, but you'd see someone walking down the street carrying a bag of Bialys, and they'd have numerals on their arm. And so the place where you could really see this was a place called Kaufman's Deli, and where there were Holocaust survivors worked. And I like that in the book I say you could get a nosh and an insult in 5 languages. So this is why my book is a stand-up comedy that's also an elegy, because the jokes create a world and that world is gone. And so you feel the sort of underlying melancholy of this world. And then the other thing I didn't quite expect, or I guess I should have, but I knew, is I began putting things in order. My parents started going together in 7th grade. They danced at my father's bar mitzvah. His name was Harold Rubenstein, everyone called him Ruby. They went together all through high school. And they got married out of high school, and my mother had just turned 21, my father was still 20. He liked to tell the story that his father had to sign for him because he was underage. So in the book I say that his father was a hard drinker. He didn't know what he was doing. He signed. And then the first year of their marriage, they had me, and then the second year they had my sister Arlene, everyone called Leanie, and the third year everything blew up. My father inherited his father's scrap metal business, and he got rich quick. It was the Korean War. There was a new metal in town called aluminum, and he sold it, and he got rich and started hanging with a fast crowd, which my mother did not like. She said they were nouveau riche narcissists, and he said he agreed, but he didn't see the problem. And so they then went to war for their whole lives. And so I began to come up with this strategy of writing these things down in the stand-up way, but they all weren't meant to be funny. It's not all jokes. So I wrote a thing called What Lasts. All their life they carried the heat of first love plus the rage of early betrayal. And so there's a lot about the war between each of them and what it was like, and a lot of stories about my father, who worshipped Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, and so he always regretted. He said, "I just have one problem. I just don't have the guts to kill people, and so I just can't be in the Bugs Meyer mob, which became Murder Incorporated." So, but it's funny, you think, my father was always saying, "God, that's just too bad." Where I think, wow, imagine if he'd been murdered, your father was in Murder Incorporated. So I kind of escaped that, but he saw it as a melancholy longing. And he decided that he went out on a lot of dates, and he decided to tell us that his dates were his wife. So once we took my sister and me to meet his wife, Pat. And we came home and told our mom that we had met Ruby's wife, Pat. And my mom said, "She's not his wife, she's a prostitute." And we said, well, what's a prostitute? She goes, well, that's a woman your father pays to touch him. Okay. So next day I went to the playground. I go, hey everyone, what's a prostitute? No one knows. They go, yeah, that's someone my dad pays to do stuff to her. This is the world we kind of grew up in. And my sister, my mother remarried. She met this guy. First we called him Kurt, then we called him Uncle Kurt, then we called him Daddy Kurt, and then we called him Dad. And my original father we called Dad, and then we called him Daddy Ruby, and then we just called him Ruby. So there's a kind of reversal there. And we knew my mother had gotten married because she came home and told us to call Uncle Kurt Daddy Kurt. And one day she had a real surprise for us. She came home and she had a baby. And we didn't know she was pregnant. We had missed it. That was my sister Nancy. So we just were kind of the way the book operates is that you just sort of go through it with us as Nene and I discover all of this and discover what they're like. And when we were moved to Skokie and my mother remarried, she decided to tell us that families should all have one name. And so your name is Hirch now. My father's name was Rubenstein. Your name is Hirch now. And so, you're 10, you're 9, you just do what your mom says. So this is the part I'm going to read you. I put this in for my sister because she told me this is her favorite word, a favorite word. Zugzwang means the same thing in life as it does in chess. You need to move, but every move makes the situation worse. When we moved to Skokie, our mother changed our last name to Hirch. She said it was better for a family to have one name. It never occurred to us to question her. Ruby found out when we showed him our report cards from Fairview School. We were proud of our good grades. He said, "What's this?" For a moment he looked stunned. Then he started yelling at us. "What's in a name?" I don't recall anyone ever calling me Edward Rubenstein. Yet that was my name until I was 9 years old. Leni can't remember anyone calling her Arlene Rubenstein either. We blocked it. Teachers must have called us Rubenstein all the time. Maybe a name is something that you take for granted as a kid. It's there, like the weather. But then the weather changes dramatically. One moment you're walking in sunlight. The next you're caught in a storm. The lawsuit. Ruby was suing your mother. He was suing you about your last name. The two of you would run it down in your heads. You were sticking together no matter what. Rubenstein or Hirch, Hirch or Rubenstein, Rubenstein, Hirch, Hirch, Rubenstein. It sounded like a jump rope game. You were the jumpers. The therapist in Evanston. Someone opened a copy of Grimm's fairy tales and an old man with a beard stepped out. He lived at the top of crooked stairs in a wooden house. He spoke with an accent and gave strange tests with ink blots that you could not pass or fail. Normality. The psychiatrist gave me his evaluation, my mom said, and you two are totally normal. She could get us to accept some real whoppers, but this one was too hard to believe. Our day in court. We're in City Hall. Everyone is dressed up. There are lots of kids in the hallway too, but no one is playing. They all look miserable. Suddenly a clerk shouts, "Rubenstein, Hirch," and we file into family court. Leni and I are lined up at one table with our mom. Ruby's sitting at another table by himself. There's an aisle between us. It's wider than the Chicago River. We all stand for the judge. We're scared of the man in the long black robes who calls us into his chambers. He wants us to decide our last name. We have no idea whether to choose mother or father. They're sitting on the other side of the door. I suggest we use both names. The judge shakes his head. This is not possible. He turns to my sister, who turns to me. She says, I'll take whatever name he takes. The judge scowls at the papers on his desk. He looks upset. He mutters something unintelligible. We trudge back to the table. Our mom goes into the chambers. We sit there fidgeting until she comes out again. Then Ruby goes into the chambers too. It takes a long time. We're leaving the courtroom. The judge has ruled. Something hard to forget. We parked outside the house on Sherwin Avenue. Ruby was sitting in the driver's seat. Leanie and I huddled in the back seat. We sobbed hysterically. Our father had lost the court case to change our name back to Rubenstein. That's why he was moving to California. I never want to see you again, he shouted at us. You're traitors. You're not my children anymore. Forget I ever existed. From now on, you're dead to me. After that, he moved to California. And I'm just jumping ahead now. I'm trying to show you there's stuff in between here so that you'll try to get the book. Case withdrawn. Leanie and I spent most of our lives believing that we knew what happened with our court case. No one told us otherwise. We were in our 60s when Beverly mentioned in passing that she had pressed Ruby to pursue the lawsuit against our last name. Beverly was his second wife. He was a reluctant plaintiff, but she was righteous and stoked his rage. Beverly also let it slip that Ruby never really lost the case. The judge convinced him to withdraw it altogether. It had nothing to do with legal merit. He argued that the fight was screwing us up. We were troubled. Ruby was furious about his decision. He felt the court had forced his hand. Therefore, he never told us. He wanted us to believe it was his fault. It was our fault. My mom didn't tell us either. She never conceded that Ruby had dropped the case. She wanted us to believe that her rash decision to change our last name was legally justified, even though it was not. She also wanted us to blame our natural father for blaming us. She got her way there too. The vault. 50 years later, my wife Lori and I took my mother to the bank. She was suffering from dementia. She wanted to check the vault. While my mom counted CDs, Lori leafed through papers. Hey, Hershey, look at this, she said. Check the date. It was a document for my name change. My mother did not change my name when I was 10 years old. That was a cover story. She changed it the night before I turned 21. Here were the adoption papers to prove it. I was not adopted at the age of 10. That was something to tell children. I was adopted when I came of age. The storyteller. When we were teenagers, my mother got us Social Security cards and passports with the name Hirch. She had no backing, no proof. The case had been withdrawn. Legally, our name was still Rubenstein. She turned on the charm. She convinced people. My sister and I weren't just irregulars. We were also illegals. On the bridge, I was going over the story again. I sighed. It's all water under the bridge now. Lori said, yes, Hershey, but you're still standing on that bridge. I was in Chicago and I was giving a talk like this. My sisters were there. And someone said, what did your sister Leanie think of all this? So I go, well, she's sitting right there. Why don't you ask her? She goes, well, Leanie, what do you think of this? She goes, well, he got some things really wrong. She was like, you know that section that you just read, the one I just read? She goes, you know how she said that we came out of the court case and we were in the car and we were in the back seat and we were all sobbing hysterically? She goes, that was wrong. We were in the front seat. So that's the corrections. And so after my father left and moved to California, my life became less complicated in some ways because he wasn't there at war with my mother. And so later he and I made it up, sort of. He called it burying a ghost, and I said, you can bury a ghost. You don't need a cemetery or a shovel or dirt. You just need amnesia. So all you need is amnesia to bury a ghost. So then I went on to Niles West High School, and this is where my friend Betty Ann and her husband James come in, because they brought my book to the Chabad and invited me. It was their idea. And Betty Ann makes a very important, she's a very important presence in the book, where I'm going through my dates in high school. And Betty Ann is right first, and it says, Betty Ann and I had some bashful backseat encounters, but I would give myself a B- because she left me for Brett Baumer, who was blonder and balmier than me. So that was our long relationship, and luckily James has forgiven her for that indiscretion in my book. And so I went through high school, and my book ends literally when I go off to college. It takes you through high school, and I went to Grinnell College. I do sort of build this story into the end of the book. I was a football player and basketball player and baseball player in high school and college. And my high school coach wanted to find a school where a freaky kid like me could play football. And so he found Grinnell College in Iowa, and I went there, and it was just right. Everyone was odd enough for me, and so I could go to Grinnell and play football for 4 years. And so it kind of ends, and I started writing poetry when I was in high school. I would suddenly break down. I was a sophomore, and I would suddenly break down crying, and I had no idea why. And I said, this is very unbecoming for a jock, especially a football player. I think now that I was mourning for my childhood and what had happened, but I didn't know that. So I just started writing things down, and I wrote them down in lines and called it poetry. And that began my journey in poetry and my journey towards a second family. My grandfather died when I was 8. And he used to babysit for my sister and me, and he used to write poems in the backs of his books, but they were really the fronts of his books because the books were in Hebrew. And we knew he was writing poetry, but we didn't have any curiosity about it. And we didn't really know what he was doing. We were just running around the house. He let us go pretty hard. And then we only calmed down because he threatened to leave. But when I was in high school and I started writing poetry, I went to my grandmother and go, whatever happened to my grandfather's poems, his poems? She goes, well, after he died, he wrote his poems in books. I think that's just a stupid thing to do, so I gave all his books away. So the poems were lost. And I asked my mother, and she said, well, he never knew how to be an American in America, which meant he never knew how to make money. And so to her, writing poetry was just another sign of his inability to be American. And so I asked my mother's sister, my aunt, and she said, well, I think they were maybe political. I think they were Zionists, but I'm not interested in politics, so I don't know what they were about. So I guess I'd say that when I began writing, I began to imagine what my grandfather's poems would be like. And when I got serious about poetry when I was in college, I think I began drawn to Eastern European and Jewish poets from Russia and Latvia and Lithuania, many who'd gone to Israel, because I heard something that imagined it was my grandfather. And I think I was actually imitating a kind of phantom there. And I guess it reminds me of what I want to say to you about the last thing I want to say before I'm going to open up the questions is that I realized I was writing about two Jewish worlds that were in collision. or three, which is my own. But the first one is my grandparents' world, which is really not very assimilated. It was heavily Jewish, Holocaust-oriented, mostly immigrants, and only partially in English. And they wanted to assimilate, but they actually weren't very good at it. But then the second generation, my mother and my father, they were on the make. They really wanted to hustle, scrap metal. My second father was sold corrugated cartons. And they just wanted to make it in the middle class, and they were Jewish, but in a very nominal reform way. And I guess I grew up with these two versions of being Jewish in these two worlds, and I think they both are inside of me. And I think that in my work and in this book, I'm trying to reconcile those two worlds, one of which is riotously funny and one of which is very elegantly sad, because it's the passing of a world. And I guess that's in my childhood in pieces, which is literally my book written in pieces and my childhood coming apart. I'm trying to capture that double world. And at the very end, the very last piece is called Childhood Was Gone. And I think this is true. My childhood had passed, but I hadn't noticed. So now I'm trying to notice. So, thank you.
We go to offer some questions. And please make it a question and draw close to the wall.
Can you tell us a little about Skokie today?
Yes.
As opposed to the Nazi marches.
Yeah, well, that happened when I went to college, but that's not Skokie today. So when I was writing about my book, I took many field trips back to Skokie and went back to the Skokie Public Library. And the most hilarious one was my sisters came with me. I was staying in a motel across the street on the park from where we grew up. And we decided to measure, I wanted to measure the distance. It was a development, and all the houses were exactly alike. And so I wanted to measure the distance between the houses because I wanted to put it in my book, which is very funny. I said this to my best friend from high school, and he said, "You exaggerate every story. Why would you want to nail down a random fact like that?" So my sisters and I were out there with a tape measure, 9 feet, it turns out, and measuring the driveway. And people started coming out of the houses like, what were we doing out there? And it turns out everyone was from India. The entire neighborhood was Southeast Asian, but the class was exactly the same, because these are starter houses. And so you can't do much with them. And they were a development. And so this was like new Americans. And so the culture was completely different, but the houses looked exactly alike. And we were counting them as we walked. I wanted to count how many were in the development. We kept getting confused because they're all exactly the same. And then we counted 91. So that just didn't make sense. So I made my four sisters, one of them was blind too. We had to go back and count them all over again. And sure enough, on our block, there were 31. There were 3 blocks. In our house, there were 31. And while we were out there puzzling over this, the people came out of their house. They go, "When was your house built?" And she told me. And then I went and looked it up, and she was wrong. And the building, they were all built in 1960. And then in 1963, someone figured out that they could squeeze one more house into the development. But when my book came out, I had 2 dream events. One was at a Skokie synagogue where we used to go, which is still there. Most of the people don't live in Skokie, but they still go to synagogue in Skokie. But the other event was Author's Night at Manny's Delicatessen in Northbrook. And there were like a third of my high school was there. I called Betty Ann to tell her about it. It was insane. So many people have still lived there. They all still live there, but they have moved out of Skokie. They've moved north to other to other suburbs. So that was a hoot. I think Skokie still has a Jewish reputation, but I can tell you it's mostly not very Jewish. I got an award from my high school, and I can tell you the high school is incredibly diverse, but Jewish kids only won one award, the B'nai B'rith projects. So but I think that Skokie has a reputation, a kind of iconic reputation for this world of two Jewish worlds. I have a lot about the history of Skokie. I have 7 pieces about it, not so much about Skokie today, but how it was first, Skokie is a Potawatomi word, and how it was founded by mound builders, and then German and Lithuanian farmers came, and which was amazing because my second father was his family fled Nazi Germany, and so he thought he was escaping Germans, but in fact it was a village founded by Germans, which was kind of a hoot to me to discover. And I sort of go through the whole history of Skokie. And I learned why Jews moved to Skokie, which I never understood, which is that in the 1920s they built a lot of houses because there was a huge housing boom. But in the 1930s it completely collapsed. And they had all these streets, and they had all these houses, and no one lived in them. And after World War II, the Skokie Village Board decided to stop building apartment buildings and encourage people to come and live in houses, and they built new houses for new Americans. And many of the other suburbs, like Kenilworth and others, were just straight out anti-Semitic. So Skokie, they blanketed Jewish neighborhoods with flyers that saying, "You're welcome here." And people came. And where Betty Ann grew up in Lincolnwood, that was just one step up the economic ladder. But actually some of it is not up the economic ladder, some of it is exactly the same. But some of it is professional. And Morton Grove is the same, pretty close, but sort of one step down over in the Niles. So you get this kind of class mix that I think is really interesting, but it turns out it was a formal decision that they were welcoming Jews because they wanted to make money and sell the houses. And Jews flocked to a place where they were welcome, and especially Holocaust survivors, because they wanted to live in a place where they felt Jews were welcome and not a place that was not virulently anti-Semitic. So that's why the Nazi March is so especially awful, because it was really targeting a place where there were so many survivors.
So I have kind of 2 questions separately. I'm kind of interested in the relationship you had with your second dad, your stepdad, and did you accept him as your father growing up?
Yes.
So that was my first question. And then my second question, I'm kind of intrigued about your role as a football player at Grinnell. You had to be a unicorn. You had to be the only Jewish football player at Grinnell, probably ever. And I was wondering if that was any sort of conflict, or did you ever experience anti-Semitism? So those are my 2 questions. One about your second dad and one about your football career.
They're not unrelated, because when my father married my mother, he discovered that I was a mama's boy. And he thought, because I was crying all the time, he thought I was too wimpy. And so he decided to get me involved in sports. And so it was really his sort of, and then it turns out I had a feel for it. Over time, I tell the story in the book how I was still thinking of him as my uncle, and I was in a batting cage, and I was there throwing, turned it up really fast, and I was hitting them really well. And he said, "Great hit." And I turned around and said, "Thanks, Dad." And that's when I realized that I had accepted him as my father. I hadn't really realized that. And when you hear me, many people have been confused by my work, because when I talk about my father, I mean my second father. Because I believe the person who raised you is your real father. I mean, of course, I had a biological father, but so yes, I accepted him as my father. And he didn't talk a lot, but he came to all my games, which was something because I play football, basketball, and baseball. And when I played at Grinnell, he also came to all my games. I mean, I was just telling a friend a very funny story where my grandmother and my mother came to a game at Grinnell, and I was playing end, and I split out to run a pattern, and my grandmother said, my sister was there, reported this to me, "Why is he so antisocial?" And my mother said, "Well, that's because he doesn't like to mix with the other players." So yeah, and then they started shouting that people were running after me. I would go back even further. We went to a very, 40% Jewish high school, and there weren't any Jewish football players there either. There were Jewish people on the baseball team, but there weren't any. What?
In tennis.
In tennis, yeah, but I didn't play tennis. But yeah, but there weren't any on the football team. I did once have a great joke. My coach, Bazrak, the ends would go, the backs would go over here, the ends would go over, the linemen would go over there. So naturally the linemen are like, they're just doing these horrible drills, beating up on each other, and the backs are like running plays where they're not touching each other. So I try as an end to go with the backs. And Coach Bazrak shouted, "Hirch, go over there with the linemen." And I said, "My mother raised me to study Talmud. She didn't raise me to go with the line and hit people like that." So he thought that was funny, but he still sent me there. There were so few Jewish football players that I don't actually remember it ever even coming up. I think the weirder thing was that I wrote poetry. That was even freakier, I think, and that did get a lot of attention. I was telling Betty Ann and James a story today about, I was in the locker room. It was a game where I was playing defensive end. This is actually in my book. And we were playing Maine South, and an end blocked me. A guard pulled out and hit me. A fullback blocked me, and then a ball player ran by me. And so Maine South ran this for 3 touchdowns in the first half. So in the halftime, I was sitting there dejected, my helmet in my hands, covered in dirt, and Bazrak was a huge guy, picks up this garbage can, starts pounding up and down on the ground. Boom, boom, boom. Hirch, stop thinking about poetry. I didn't even know he knew I was reading it. So at Grinnell, they thought that was okay. And that's why Bazrak, I think, found this conference. And the 2 best schools in the conference, because I was getting scholarship offers, but they were very big schools, and he just didn't think I would get along well with the coaches. And so he found these schools, and I applied to Carleton and Grinnell. And Carleton's actually even better academically. But when I went there, I didn't like the coach because he didn't have a passing game. It's a ridiculous reason to choose a college, but in any case, I didn't want to run, I didn't want to block, I wanted to catch passes, so that was it. But yes, I think still there are very few Jewish football players. Along these lines, though, I will say something. I have a piece about my grandfather called Alternate Masculinity. And it's about how my grandfather would take my arm and kiss me on the upper arm. And it was incredibly tender. And I believe because I was already going towards sports, I think I learned another idea of masculinity from my grandfather, in my opinion, a better one. And in my poetry, I've tried to imitate that kind of tenderness, which I think comes into Jewish poetry in ways it doesn't always come into other kinds of poetry. So, thank you.
May I ask you how your sight influenced your ability to play football?
Oh, that's much later.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, I could see fine when I was playing football. That would be a good one, though. Yeah, no, I don't think you could play football if you were. My sight was fine when I was in college.
Hi, you said you grew up in Skokie. Did you talk about in your book about your religious experience, bar mitzvahs, the Hebrew school, synagogues that you went to?
Sure. I'm afraid that my mother sent us to Temple Sholem, which was really far away. It was a very elite synagogue on Lakeshore Drive, and it was snobby, and she wanted to go there, but we had to get up on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. and go, and so I really resented it, because your Sunday starts at 7:30 and then it ends at 3 when you're the last one dropped off on the bus. But something seeped in. I was bar mitzvahed there, and became a man. I tell the story in my book, and I said, why do so many people give me fountain pens? It wasn't as if I was going to become a writer. So I guess what I would say is that later, Judaism has been very important to me, but I guess I would say I invented my own. And what I mean by that is that I invented my own by reading. I had going to synagogue as an experience, and had the high holidays as an experience, but I think that my identity was forged by reading Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, and Spinoza's Ethics, and Freud, and other thinkers. And I think that I began from this to patch together my own idea of what it would be to be a Jewish person and have a Jewish community and to be a Jewish writer. But now I'm remembering there's a joke about Freud in my book, which is Freud says that the eldest Jewish son who has his mother's love always goes through life feeling like a conqueror. So I say, addendum, what sort of conqueror reads Freud? So I guess I found my way back to Judaism or into Judaism or deeper Judaism, not so much by the shoal that I grew up in, but by my cultural identity and then my reading. I was talking to a very close friend of mine who's a rabbi, and I said to her, Kafka says, what do I have in common with other Jews? I have hardly anything in common with myself. And she said, yes, that's a very Jewish position. You can't get out of this group. Sorry to have a disappointing answer.
Not at all.
Okay.
I'm really enjoying the book, and Ruby is such a rich character, and I'm just curious, some of the stories you tell, I was highlighting. What was your relationship like as you grew older? I don't know how long he lived, and I know he moved to California, but I'm just sort of curious what role he played in your life later.
One of my friends said to me, I just want to say, something along the lines you said. He may have been a bad father, but he's a great literary character. You can't take your eyes off him because of what he's doing. And so it wasn't so great to have him as a father, but what he's doing is so entertaining and so sort of wild and off the chains that, and the stuff he's saying to you in retrospect is just so crazy. In the sense of over-confiding. Capturing that, I had a lot of affection for him because he's just alive as a character and as a person. But as a father, it was a bit unfortunate. I saw him very rarely after I was 10. He came once. I tell the story in the book of how my sister and I met him once when we were teenagers. And I saw him once in my 20s, and I was visiting him to try and put something together. We're in a swimming pool, and he started telling me things about my mother sexually. And I go, no one wants to hear this. You just don't want to hear that. I go, I'm not your buddy, I'm your son. If you keep it up, I'm going to leave. And he kept it up and I left. I got out of the pool and I went to a room, I changed, I called a cab, and I went to the airport and I didn't see him again for 7 years after that. But when I was in my 30s, I wanted to be a father. And my first wife and I were going to adopt our son. And I thought, I should not be an enraged son if I'm going to be a good father. I should let it go. And so I decided, for my own sake, not for his sake, I should let it go. And so I flew out to see him, and we got along. And after that, we got along really well. I think as long as I didn't think him as my father, as I just thought of him as a person that, that I had a relationship with, as long as I didn't expect anything or want anything, we got along super well. And we went to Las Vegas, he's a hoot, and he just was really fun, and he was great to be around, as long as you didn't think of him as your father, because that wasn't going to work very well. But there is a really funny story I'll tell you. When I became the president of the Guggenheim Foundation in 2003, I was talking to him on the phone that the Guggenheim was going to throw me a big party at a very classy club called the Century Association. And he said, I'm coming. I go, well, I don't really want you to come. I don't think it's a good idea. He goes, I'm coming. So he came to this party. So there's this incredible crowd of intellectuals and artists, and there's my father, Ruby. And there's a composer. There's a composer at Princeton named Paul Lansky. So Paul Lansky is Meyer Lansky's nephew. And he is a distinguished avant-garde composer. My father is beside himself. And I could hear him, I was over here talking to him. I could hear my father over here talking to Paul, who's a very refined person. And my father's going, Meyer Lansky was a genius. And Paul said, well, people don't usually say that. He goes, they're wrong. He founded Las Vegas. Meyer Lansky is a genius. And Paul said, well, there's a thing on the site at Ellis Island saying there are people we shouldn't have let into the United States. They're stupid. Meyer Lansky is one of the greatest people we've ever let into this country. It's like, this is so crazy to hear this, but I found it very entertaining. And so I also have a lot of stories about my mother and her meeting various poets and intellectuals and her engagement. I'll tell you the best one. I said I had won a prize and my mother was there at the award ceremony, and I introduced her to Ted Hoagland. And I said, hey Mom, this is Ted Hoagland, he's one of our greatest nature writers. And my mom said, Eddie never knew very much about nature. So I go, Jesus, Mom, that's just so uncool. She goes, well, don't worry, Mr. Hoagland, he knows a lot of adjectives. But yes, thank you for pointing it out. I thought writing about Ruby was very exciting and interesting, and I learned a lot trying to formulate it into his character, and I began to understand him. My sister and I disagree about this because I'm very forgiving now, because my parents were very young, and they had no experience, and they didn't know what they were doing. But she has a different attitude, and she's, it's her own experience. By the way, for anyone here who wants to write a memoir, I highly recommend having a sister who goes through psychoanalysis. She remembers everything. She doesn't think anything is funny. It's really good if you want to do stuff. Like once, this was funny, she said, okay, because I was running all my stories by her when I was running it, because she and I went through everything, and many people have pointed out to me she's the hero, the secret hero of the book, because we're doing everything together. And she said, you can't make this funny. So when she was 7, she was in bed for a year, and she couldn't walk, and the nurse who took care of her she got interested in nursing, and she said to my mom, I think I want to be a nurse. And my mom said, Jewish girls can't become nurses. She goes, that's just not funny. Well, give me 15 minutes. So I called her back and said, I've got something for you. Poor Deborah, wet nurse of Rebecca, mother of Jacob. If we're up to my mom, she never would have made it into Genesis. So she said, that is funny. So.
Other questions? Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you.